Good afternoon, and welcome to the first Lightbulb Café of the school year. Penn Arts and Sciences has rebranded its Lightbulb Café series into a virtual book club to give audiences near and far a chance to hear from our wonderful faculty authors about their work and what inspired them, and generally to ask questions. For this special Homecoming Week edition, we've partnered with the Penn Global Discovery Series, which invites alums to explore the world virtually. I'm Julie Alexeeva, an assistant professor in English and a core faculty member in the Cinema and Media Studies, the new Cinema and Media Studies department. I'm really excited to be moderating this discussion with critically acclaimed author Kristen Ghodsee. Kristen is a professor and chair of the Department of Russian and East European Studies. Her research interests include the lived experience of socialism and post-socialism, the gendered effects of the economic transition from communism to capitalism, and the ethnographic study of post-communist nostalgia in Central and Eastern Europe. Kristen has written or co-written 12 books, including Red Valkyries, Feminist Lessons from 5 Revolutionary Women, Red Hangover, Legacies of 20th Century Communism, and the best-selling Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, and Other Arguments for Economic Independence, which has been translated into 15 languages. And that's my personal favorite of your other books, too. Today we'll be discussing her new book, Everyday Utopia, What 2,000 Years of Wild Experiments Can Teach Us About the Good Life. The book is a survey of 2 millennia of utopian approaches in different cultural contexts and across many diverse historical epochs. It takes us on a trip around the world to explore places that reimagine how we might live our daily lives, from Danish co-housing communities to matriarchal Colombian eco-villages to Chinese microdistricts. And following our discussion, we should have plenty of time for questions. So if you have any questions for Kristen, please text to Lightbulb to 22333, so 22333, and I'll pass it off to Kristen.
All right, so I'm going to get started with just a little bit of a reading from the introduction, the end of the introduction to the book. This comes from a section in the book called Why Martin Luther King Jr. Loved Star Trek. Although I am too young to have seen the original series while it was airing, another science fiction show has the distinction of being the longest-lasting and most influential utopian vision that ever entered popular culture. When Star Trek began broadcasting in 1966, its creator, Gene Roddenberry, crafted a positive view of the future where humanity had overcome all of its conflicts and lived in a sort of galactic Pax Romana within something called the United Federation of Planets, an interstellar union of different worlds and species with shared principles of universal liberty, rights, and equality. In a 2011 interview, the late actress Nichelle Nichols, who played the African communications officer, Uhura, on the original Star Trek Enterprise, recounted a story of her first meeting with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. at a banquet. King told Nichols that he was a huge fan of the show and that it was the only thing that he and his wife allowed their children to stay up late to watch. At the time, Nichols intended to leave the show to pursue a career in the theater, but King insisted that she had to stay. Nichols recalled, "He said I had the first non-stereotypical role. I had a role with honor, dignity, and intelligence. He said, 'You simply cannot abdicate. This is an important role. This is why we are marching. We never thought we'd see this on TV.'" For the first generation of Black Trekkies, Nichols' portrayal of an officer on the bridge of the interracial Starship Enterprise helped them envision the possibility of equality. "When I was a little girl," explained the actress Whoopi Goldberg in 2014, "it was like, oh, we, Black people, are in the future. Uhura did that for me." "Imagination is more important than knowledge," said Albert Einstein in 1931. "For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution." We stand on the cusp of a new age, with many of us striving towards a more positive vision of the future, like the one Roddenberry once provided, where human beings find a way to build a better world for subsequent generations of humanity. Our old ideas about patrilineality and patrilocality are no longer fit for that purpose. We need new ideas, new dreams, and the courage to imagine alternative futures. Now is the moment to think different. If we can imagine them first in a galaxy far, far away, it's only a matter of time before we boldly go and begin figuring out how to translate these inspired visions into our own everyday utopias.
Great. I love how that passage brings it into the realm of the everyday that most people already knew a little bit about, or at least some of us. So I'd love to ask you a few questions about the book. And the first is, how did you get the idea to write something like this, especially after your previous books, which dealt more with the role of women, specifically in post-communist societies versus communist societies, and strong women throughout history? What about this moment made you think about creating a book like this?
Yeah, so I think that, this was very much a project that grew out of my previous books, in the sense that I have always been really interested in women's rights and the ways in which women's lives and the material conditions of family life, more broadly speaking, are impacted by the social, political, and economic systems within which we live. And my previous work was really focused on what I would think of as sort of top-down kinds of experiments. So more classically sort of socialist or communist societies, where laws are made, administrative decrees are made, and then they're supposed to kind of trickle down and change the nature of everyday life. This was a project that wanted to reverse that and look at the bottom and say, what is it about what people do in their everyday lives? What have people historically done when states are irresponsive, or states are oppressive, or states are just somewhat nefariously promoting an ideology or a way of living that alienates and oppresses a lot of people in that society? Do people just give up? No, they don't. They fight back, sometimes directly, and sometimes they fight back by running away, or by creating their own little communities outside of the framework. And so a lot of people talk about this concept of prefigurative politics, which is when people decide to live in a certain way, they organize their lives in a way as if the world they want to see built already exists. And so this was an attempt for me to kind of reverse the angle. I was very much, as a scholar, because of the nature of my work, focused on what governments do and how that changes things. And here I really wanted to look at what ordinary people do, and how sometimes ordinary people on the ground make changes and decisions about the way they're living their own lives and organizing their families and social relations that end up kind of trickling up and changing society in a bigger way.
So there is an element of pretty profound hope then in the book for people to transform their own lives, and the potential for that to have a trickle-up effect, I suppose, in changing the larger world.
Exactly. So one of the things that I'm really, because we live in a moment when a lot of people have lost hope. I mean, we both teach at a university, and we work with young people. And I think there are a lot of people in the world today that are suffering for all sorts of different reasons. But we know from all of the sociological data and epidemiological data that we have that people are struggling with despair and anxiety and, what the Germans called Weltschmerz, like world pain, right? Just that the world that we're living in is a difficult place within which to exist right now. And so, but it often has been that way, right? If we look back in history, there have always been moments when people were suffering or unhappy, or they were living under conditions of great injustice. And some people have allowed themselves to be beaten down and immobilized by that, but others have committed to hope and committed to change. And so I was really fascinated, and I still remain fascinated by those groups in society that, despite the difficulties of the world that they're facing, they decide to do something anyway. They remain agents of their own history. They remain people in charge of their own lives. And they do it not by themselves, but by forging communities. And it's those communities that seem so important and so essential to me right now, for us as a society to be studying, to be thinking about in a profound way, because I think we can learn from them. Yeah.
I think it might be a great opportunity to actually ask you about some of these communities that you're talking about. Maybe, do you have a few favorite examples that you want to share, you'd like to use, that maybe something in your research that surprised you a little bit?
Yeah.
Or-
So, I mean, I think what's unique about the book is it is not just a survey of what we might think of as secular communities. I'm very capacious in my definition of utopian communities, and so I do include a lot of utopian communities of faith. And so that means that when you kind of broaden the scope, you can really go back and look at Cenobitic monastic communities, the very early followers of the Buddha, for instance, or Christians pre 325, before Christianity became a state religion under Constantine. Early Christians were kind of weird utopian hippie groups in some ways, right? That grew out into, this massive world religion, as did Buddhism. So, but within those, there are interesting examples of, one of my favorite examples, because I was just there and I visited them, is a group of experimental archaeologists in southern Germany that are building an ideal 9th century Benedictine cloister using the methods and materials of the 9th century. And they're doing it. It's an ideal community based on a document from 530 AD called the Rule of Saint Benedict. And it's about how a group of non-related people could live in harmony with each other and with nature. And the secret to this, apparently, from an architectural point of view, is lots of bathrooms. And they knew that in the 9th century, which I think is really interesting.
It's very true.
It's very true.
Everyone needs their own bathroom.
Everybody needs lots of bathrooms, right? So there are little examples, but all over the world, there's like the Colombian example of the matriarchal eco-village called Nashira, where women are in charge and, they have a solar-powered restaurant. There is a experimental environmental eco-village in southern Portugal called Tamara. There is an intentional community in rural Virginia called Twin Oaks, which has been around since 1967. So there are small contemporary examples. There are historical examples like the Beguine nuns or the Bogomils, which start out in what was once the Bulgarian kingdom, and then they kind of move into northern Italy and southern France, and where they become the Cathars or the Albigensians, and then the Catholic Church completely wipes them out. So there's all of these really interesting, both spiritual and secular communities that have decided for one reason or another to live together in community, to raise children more cooperatively, to share more generously with each other, and basically to prioritize connection and community over, things like wealth accumulation and economic growth. And I think that there's an interesting way in which when you survey history and you look at different historical epochs and you look at different cross-cultural circumstances, the same basic set of ideas keeps reappearing over and over and over again, which I think is fascinating given how much of those particular ideas are incongruous with the way that we, particularly in the global north, organize our domestic lives today.
And that reminds me of, and I know we've talked about this before, but David Graeber's recent book too.
Yes.
So a way of rethinking the way that most humans are taught, most people are taught, at least in the North American context, about the inevitability or essential sort of human nature as being selfish. Right. But what both you and David Graeber sort of provide is this, not just sort of, but actually provide, is an argument against that, right? That actually these cooperative practices and living experiments have been around for a very long time and across different regions around the world.
Absolutely. And, and I do think, like, if you go back, first of all, David Graeber and David Wengerow's book, The Dawn of Everything, is a huge inspiration to me. Absolutely. I think that what they've done is they've gone back and they've said, hey, everything you think you know about human history, guess what? It's probably wrong. And you've been told a certain story about the way we live, about the way we organize our families, about the way we treat each other, about the way we own property. That is very useful for justifying contemporary political arrangements, but it turns out from an archaeological and an anthropological record is just wrong. And what they do is to say nothing about the way we live is natural. And so in that book, they don't really deal with the private sphere as much. They're really interested much more in sort of political organizing. They're talking about the nation state and inequality, I think, is the big target. I talk about inequality, but I'm really focused on the way that we organize our private lives, our domestic lives. And if we know anything about human beings as a species from an evolutionary anthropological point of view, is that we are so flexible, we are so creative, and we are so adaptive. When climatic or geographic or environmental or political or economic circumstances change, we readjust. And we're really good. And so that means that our particular family form that we have in this contemporary moment come to think of as normal or natural, and I use those words in quotes very carefully, which is sort of the romantic relationship as the container for parenthood, where you have relatively exclusive biparental care for your own biological offspring in a single family home surrounded by hordes of your own privately owned stuff. That is a relatively recent model. It is evolutionarily out of step with the way we evolved as cooperative breeders. And the argument in the book is that it's making us really unhappy and miserable. And so obviously, so many of us, I mean, the statistics on loneliness and social isolation in this country are abysmal. And that's true of the UK. It's less true of other industrialized countries, but particularly in the United States, Canada, and the UK, those numbers are epidemic levels. Even the Surgeon General is worried about this. So if that's the case, let's look at the way we're living. Let's look at the things that we're doing and try to address those problems using the tools that we have through history and evolutionary anthropology that reveal that we are creative, flexible, and adaptive creatures, and we could just as easily rearrange our lives to be more connected and less isolated if we so choose. And it turns out that also helps us deal with inequality. So in the sense that this book overlaps with Graeber and Wengrow's work, it's that real focus on the perpetuation of inequality and the ways in which our contemporary family forms really exist to facilitate the intergenerational transfer of wealth and privilege, largely historically from fathers to their legitimate sons, but now just within the nuclear family.
Yeah, and I love how the book fundamentally also seems to be about a way that humans can be happier and just be more in community with others. You talked about the epidemic of loneliness. I certainly see this with my students, with my friends, and I can't imagine infinitely more people that are experiencing this. Everyone, to an extent, living in this society in which we live. I found this quote from the feminist Ellen Willis from 1979, and I found this quote from an article in the New York magazine or newspaper Village Voice. And it reminded me so much of your book, so I wanted to just read it out loud, because I think what this quote offers is a reminder that fundamentally these projects of rethinking the way that we live, our family structures, our education, practice around private possessions, is about love and about community. So she says in this article, and the article is called "The Family, Love It or Leave It," and she says, "I realize that the kind of change I'm talking about amounts to a social and psychic revolution of almost inconceivable magnitude, yet to refuse to fight for love that is both free and responsible is in a sense to reject the possibility of love itself." So I'm wondering if you would like to sort of respond to this. This article was actually on the syllabus for the late political theorist and philosopher Mark Fisher's class, the last class that he ever taught. So it just seems especially prescient. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think Mark Fisher is best known for his little sort of chapbook called Capitalist Realism, where he really feels, he argues in that book that there's this sort of zeitgeist that there is no alternative, right? That we are precluded from imagining a world outside of the framework within which we currently exist. Frederick Jameson most famously said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And yet we know that things change and that economic systems rise and fall. You know, if you were born in the later years of the Roman Empire, which had existed for centuries at that point, it would be inconceivable to imagine that there would be a world where the Roman Empire didn't exist. And yet we know that it ceased to exist, right? So, and if you think about feudalism, if you think about slavery, if you think about all sorts of different political economic systems, the one thing we know from an historical point of view is that things change. Love, however, family, community, connection. I've been really digging into, we have a phrase in English called kith and kin, your kith and kin. And your kinfolk are the people that you are related to by blood. But there used to be a word in English, kithfolk, which I believe the Oxford English Dictionary now considers archaic and rare and obsolete. We don't use the word kith anymore. We don't use the word kithfolk anymore. And yet, our kith and our kin, so our kithfolk are our relation, not our blood relations, but our community, our friends, our neighbors, our, you know, the people that we go hunting with or whatever, the people that we watch sports with, the people that we hang out with, people in the local bar or whatever. Those people are so important to us. And here's the thing that this book, I feel like what it tries to nail down and in the way it responds to that quote is to say that the way we have commodified love and connection in our contemporary society. And this is, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on where you are in the world, okay? But the sort of hegemonic narrative about like time is money and you invest in your relationships, right? And you spend time with people. You don't share time with people, you spend time. We use money words to quantify our relationships, right? And I think that that is a very recent invention, and it is a very problematic one. And if we look out across human history, what we see is people spending time together in communities of love and emotional support and care that consist of both kin and non-kin, or in this case, kith, right? That's what's consistent about humanity. It's not the desire to have a bigger or better house or a nicer car or a fancier phone, right? David Wengrow and David Graeber very clearly show us that there are hierarchical, unequal societies, but there are also very egalitarian societies, and that egalitarianism is a chosen way of life that people fight for and defend because they look over at the inequality at the neighbors, right? They talk about schismogenesis as their concept. If you lived next to a highly unequal society, your society is going to be highly equal because you don't want anything to do with those people because look at how awful they are, right? Look how badly they treat each other. And so, but in both societies, no matter where you are in the social hierarchy, what do people want? They want love, they want connection, and they want community. And what I think that quote, the psychic revolution that she's talking about in 1979, is within the context of a world where love and connection are increasingly luxury goods that only wealthy people can afford to spend time and money on to cultivate. And the rest of us are, you know, at home on our phones or watching Netflix, being isolated and, you know, eating Ben and Jerry's out of the bucket.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, nothing
Just
wrong with that.
FYI.
No shade. I mean, you know, but I'm just saying that there's a way in which we have prioritized the wrong things for too long, and it is making us desperately unhappy and unwell.
And it also suggests a way to practice this form of egalitarianism in our everyday lives, right? Without, I mean, in conjunction with protesting and voting and all of those other things that are very important and good. But I remember a part of the book where you talk about sharing your clothes with your daughter. Yeah.
Wardrobe communism.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, which a lot of people already do with their friends or partners. And generally, I love how every chapter starts with an example of in your everyday life personally, and how this expands and how it connects to what people were practicing elsewhere. So I'm also really curious about the order of the chapters in the book, which starts from, it's almost as if the book grows like a child does. Like it starts with housing, like, okay, you're in a house, then childhood, then education, and then possessions. You start accumulating things. Then you maybe get married. The next chapter is nuclear family and marriage. And then what are those families? Do they have babies? You know, so there's this sort of cyclical aspect. So I'm curious whether it seems intentional. So I just wanted to bring it to the fore.
Yeah. I mean, and it definitely, so I think, as I was conceiving of the book, I was thinking about the model, right? What I described earlier as sort of the romantic relationship as the container for parenthood in the single family home with all of your stuff. And so I wanted to kind of break each part of that out and say, okay, let's look at how did we get here? How did we get to the single family home? How did we get to privatized childhood, exclusive biparental care? How did we get to education, which reinforces all of these models in a particular way and sort of teaches people that competition is more important than cooperation, that like individuality and individual excellence and exceptionality is more important than like some kind of community effort? How do we get to a world in which like we all have our own lawnmowers and snowblowers and, you know, whatever various appliances, when those are the kinds of things that we could so easily share with our neighbors, right?
Why does everyone need a drill?
Right, yeah, exactly. Right. Why don't we have tool libraries? Why don't we have toilet? I mean, so how do we get to the, I mean, it's a real genuine question, right? Why do we have the amount of stuff that we have? Why do we need the amount of stuff that we have? And then finally, and the most difficult one, which is 2 chapters, is how did we get to the family form that we have? And so the big sort of intervention that I make at this book, at the end, you know, so I kind of have to walk you through. So we go housing, and then childcare, and then education, and then property, and then family. And the idea is ultimately that we can separate our mating practices, you know, our attachments that are romantic or even platonic, but our mating practices from our child rearing practices. So for instance, in the book, I talk about cenobitic monastic communities. So these are cloisters of nuns or clusters of monks, people who live together, and they're celibate. But they still take in children, right? They take in orphans, they often take in historically unwanted children for one reason or the other. So they raise those children collectively. Even within those celibate clusters, you often have pairs. They're platonic pairs, but people, humans, we're pair bonders. We pair bond. We pair bond in lots of different ways. We have different marriage practices, but historically and from an evolutionary anthropological point of view, we are cooperative breeders, which means that even if we have primary pairs, we raise our children with wider groups of what are called alloparents. So these can be grandmothers and grandfathers, these can be aunts and uncles, these can be cousins. In some religious traditions, they're godparents. They can be your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues. They can be chosen family, right? So there are all of these different models that really basically sort of boil down to this idea of it takes a village, right? And when I was writing this book, because it's a popular book, and I know you are also somebody who sort of like gets out of the ivory tower occasionally to speak to more general audiences, it was really important for me to take these sometimes complicated ideas and root them in personal experience, right? To tell a story about myself as a mom, as a partner, as a colleague, as a friend, as a mentor to young people. Like, how do those relationships get sort of intertwined and interwoven through the social, political, and economic world in which I live? And I know you've done that too, right? You want to say a little bit about that challenge, right?
Yeah.
Of bringing yourself into your scholarly work.
Right. It is a little difficult, but very, very important, I think, because I think as a scholar, I always try to imbue the things that I'm interested in researching with my own personal experience, and then try to bring my scholarship to the world at large rather than just keep it in the ivory tower. So I have a graphic novel called Soviet Daughter that I published before coming to Penn, and I've been publishing kind of shorter graphic narrative pieces that often have to do with my research. And I'm wondering whether this is a good point to bring in a project that we've sort of started thinking about doing, hopefully when things calm down a little bit with our work lives. But I think we were thinking of calling it something like the gaslighting of Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about that idea that connects to your book with Mitchell Orenstein?
Yeah. So, I mean, I definitely think that, there's a sort of certain narrative about the way that the collapse of communism happened, that we've been told in the West, and that people in that part of the world have been told, which was basically, communism was awful and everything about it was unsustainable. Their economies were falling apart. Their industries were non-viable. And everything that happened after 1989 in Eastern Europe and after 1991 in the Soviet Union was just peachy keen, right? Everything was great. Democracy came, and people got to eat McDonald's, and they got Levi's, and they got good Western whiskey and perfume, and so life was much better. The book that I wrote with Mitchell Orenstein, which came out in 2021 with Oxford University Press, called Taking Stock of Shock, really shows that for a very substantial percentage of people living in the region, they have not yet attained the standard of living that they had in 1989, right? So 30 years after the transition from socialism to capitalism, they're actually still poorer and do not have the kinds of caloric intake and access to resources that they had under this really awful, horrible political system called communism. The worst part of, so that book is written. Yeah, and that is all based on data. Mitchell Orenstein is a political scientist, and we crunch the numbers. It all comes from the World Bank. It all comes from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That data is all online. Nobody has criticized the data. But the project that I think that we need to do is to talk about the ways in which East Europeans who were suffering through those difficult decades, the deepest and a recession that was deeper and longer than the American Great Depression in the 1930s, were told that everything was fine, that everything was going just great. That's like really adding insult to injury, right? It's really saying, oh my God, so the world is falling. There's literally a recession, a depression going on, a catastrophic depression. And at the same time, you're being told, oh, well, if you're not eating, it's because you're not working hard enough. If your house isn't heated, it's because you just haven't gotten on board with the capitalist way of doing things, right? It's all your fault. And so not only were people suffering from real material deprivation, but they were also suffering from gaslighting.
Right.
And I think there's a wonderful maybe graphic novel or story that can be told about why that was allowed to happen to people for so long.
Yeah, and that's something that I experienced with my own family, right?
Yeah.
Because the stories that you're usually told are the success stories, but the success stories are actually a small percentage compared to the average person. So hopefully we'll get a chance to go more into that and do that. I think that'd be great. I'd love to ask you about, I know that you're kind of in the middle of a book tour, just finished a book tour. I know you had to kind of rejigger things about how you present the book depending on the audience, and how has the book tour changed or revitalized some aspects of your research? What were some interesting responses that you found as you have been doing these book talks for the last few months?
Yeah, so the book came out about 6 months ago, and I've had the opportunity to go all around the United States, both in person and virtually. And I've also been in Germany and the United Kingdom and in Belgium. I was just in Belgium like 2 weeks ago. And so it's really interesting. The book just came out. It came out in Dutch. It came out in German, and it's coming out soon, I think, in Spanish, as well as in Japanese. So they're these things sort of happen, and then it takes on a life of its own. But the thing that has really inspired me, I will tell you, is when I hear from audiences, is that people keep walking up to me after I give a talk, and they say, it's already happening. We're already doing it. You can't see it. And so I'll give you a concrete example. So there was a guy who came up to me after a talk in London and said, in London, they have those row houses, and then everybody has those little gardens in the back, and they're kind of all fenced off from each other. So him and two of his university friends and their wives were getting sort of close to retirement age, and their kids were grown. And so they decided to buy 3 row houses right next to each other, and they tore down the fences between their gardens. And they're basically treating those 3 houses as like one big living complex. But he said, in the cadaster and from a tax perspective and from the perspective of the government, it just looks like 3 individual families buying houses right next to each other. They don't know what's going on behind the scenes, right? People are having platonic parenting experiments. There are mommunes. A woman came up to me and showed me pictures of her friendship commitment ceremony on her phone. So the thing that I missed, I think, when I was writing the book, and it was fair because it was the pandemic. And so I was doing a lot of this work kind of, in isolation, really, was every community that I studied was a community that made an intentional decision to live a particular way. And they had a rationale for doing that. And what I missed and what I'm learning now, mostly from readers and people who reach out to me and email me or, contact me one way or the other, or I talk to in person, or I get questions on an event like this, is where people are saying, look what I'm doing in my life that's different. I'm doing it. I'm already doing it. And that is so inspiring because it made me realize that sometimes change happens because a group of people get together and make a decision about a particular way of living in the world. But sometimes change also happens because smaller subsets of those groups just decide, this sucks. I'm tired of being alone in my house. I'm gonna move in with a couple of other people and we're gonna cook meals 4 nights a week. Which is what I did when I was in grad school. I'm gonna, buy a house next to my best friend. I'm gonna move in. When I have kids, I've heard a lot of people saying this, my best friend and her husband, we're all gonna buy a house together and we're gonna raise our kids together like a family because it's just gonna be easier that way, right? We're gonna share a car and we're gonna share a wheelbarrow and a lawnmower and a drill and all those other things. And it'll make it cheaper. It'll make it environmentally more sustainable. It will deal with isolation and loneliness. It will create a happier environment for our kids. And that's just like one step, right? That's just 2 couples. But imagine if half of new parents decided to do that, right? That would change things in a remarkable way really fast. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be organized or articulated. And so a lot of people would come up to me after a talk and say, I wouldn't call myself a utopian. I would never use that word. But listening to you talk about utopia makes me think that some of what I'm doing is a little utopian. And that is hopeful, and that gives us kind of encouragement that we're being recognized as taking charge and doing something in the absence, of course, of these larger political changes that we can still hope for and work towards. But we have to play the long game and the short game. And I think the short game starts at home. It starts with our friends. It starts with our families. It starts with our sharing of smallest things in our daily lives. And it can make a difference really fast in a really big way.
Right. The interweaving of the personal with the political.
Exactly.
Great. So we are now going to move on to audience questions. If you have any questions for Kristen, please text Lightbulb to 22333 or follow the link in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and look at some of your questions here. There is a question about cooperative child raising. And they'd love to know your references and influences and maybe different examples of cooperative child raising.
Great, yeah. So there's a whole chapter in the book called Children as Public Goods, which makes this argument that we are basically benefiting from everybody in society who raises children, but we don't actually subsidize that, particularly in the United States where we don't have job-protected paid parental leave, and we don't have subsidized childcare, which they do in other countries. There's another chapter that deals with the evolutionary anthropology So the examples that I look at in the early chapter are places like Twin Oaks, places like the kibbutzim in Israel. I look at the Oneida community in upstate New York. There are a wide variety. I look at what I call in the book Bible communist communities like the Bruderhof and the Hutterites. There are lots of different examples of communities which raise their children in common historically. And then from an evolutionary anthropological point of view, I really look at the work of people like Sarah Hrdy and Leslie L. Kramer, who talk about our evolutionary history of cooperative breeding and why cooperative breeding is actually uniquely the result of the way that as primates we have our children much earlier, like premature and closer together than other primates, and also so that's the why we were cooperative breeders, and then the result of why we're cooperative breeders has to do, Hrdy makes the argument that like human cognition, language, religion, nation states, all of that actually emerges from the fact that we had to cooperate in order to raise our children because they're born very close together and we have lots of them and we can't possibly provision them biparentally, so we literally need a village. It takes a village to raise them. So there are lots of different examples in the book specifically dealing with how and why historically and anthropologically we have children, and then examples of communities today who are doing it in this more cooperative way.
And this is also a related question, which connects to something you've just said a few minutes ago, but this person is thinking about how one can make mini utopias throughout our days, like a workplace utopia or a rec league utopia. And when I read this, I immediately think about kind of the first decade of the Soviet Union and these work gatherings where after work you would have a space to, and I talk about this in my book a little bit too, spaces to gather to put on plays and listen to poetry and to read books and to play chess, and so that is what immediately came to mind with regard to these rec league utopias. So I'm curious what your thoughts on about mini utopias.
Yeah, I think in the United States, every time I walk by one of those little free public library books, little free libraries they're called, I think, those little boxes where you get free books and you leave a book, take a book, like that's enacting a little utopia, right? Like I'm just gonna free cycle books through my neighborhood. Libraries, I think in Chicago they have tool libraries. Some places have toy libraries. So these are spaces, now again, these are publicly funded spaces where people are sharing goods. But there are also these private places, right? I think about makers spaces. Maker space culture is fascinating. Right to repair, guys. In Australia, they have these things called men's sheds, which are just places where people go and there are tools and there's wood and people come and bring things and fix things. And maker spaces, a lot of people just take old electronics and there's just a room where you can go and you just like tinker with electronics and people build stuff or take stuff apart and people teach each other like laterally about how circuit boards work and how you could rejigger circuit boards. There's so many interesting examples of ways that we can pull utopia into our daily lives. And so, yeah, in our workplaces, obviously there's a lot of room for utopia. But I think a lot of this has to do with like prioritizing community and connection over the bottom line, always thinking about the bottom line. And plenty of people are talking about, what they call sort of cooperative capitalism as opposed to sort of cutthroat capitalism. I'm not interested in those models, but I think that there's place within those models to really kind of reimagine the way that we inhabit our work spaces and our leisure spaces that are more collective and more connected.
And there are examples of kind of more giant macro decisions in the sphere of the personal, like buying a house with your friends. Yeah. But then there's also, I think about, I'm really obsessed with my neighborhood buy nothing group, where this is especially useful for people with kids, right? Because they grow out of things. And then what do? They wear something for like a couple months and it's over. So just circulating it back into the community and, please for help if there's a cat that appeared and no one knew what to do with it, so just that's already happening.
Yeah. And I think that we saw it during the pandemic, right? When those lockdowns happen, first thing, people rushed out to form pandemic pods, right? They were like, okay, I have to do all the childcare and all the education on my own. I need other people because I can no longer just outsource it, right? I have to do it. So now I need community. The other thing that is really clear is that people formed mutual aid societies. And they were buying groceries for elderly neighbors, and they were really checking in on each other. And like all of that goodwill happened within the context of the pandemic. Yes, because it was an extraordinary circumstance, but that means that it's latent in our society. It's right there under the surface. When the circumstances are right, we are so altruistic and cooperative with the people with whom we share a community. So why not activate that a little bit more? So absolutely, I think there are many, many examples of ways that we can bring these ideas into our daily lives. And it doesn't have to necessarily be coordinated. We can make those decisions for ourselves and our immediate friends, neighbors, and colleagues.
And the pandemic was also the background of your writing this book.
Yeah.
Did that change? This is my own question, so I apologize, but did it change the way that you conducted your research and surely the fact that so much of daily life has transformed in an enormous way changed or influenced the way that you wrote it?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the pandemic for me was this incredible thought experiment, social experiment, right? In how we are really quite cooperative when it matters, right? Rebecca Solnit has a beautiful book called A Paradise Built in Hell, where she talks about the way that people respond after natural disasters. And it did change the way I was writing because A, I wanted to write for a broader audience. B, as an ethnographer, I couldn't go out and live in the communities that I was studying. So I had to be very creative about the ways in which I was contacting people. And C, I also think that because I wasn't doing anything else in my life, really. Some people were making sourdough, some people were brewing kombucha or whatever. I was really researching utopian communities. I went down a rabbit hole. I was mainlining books about every single weird little community that I could find historically and really trying to be capacious globally about these communities, because I also talk about Tanzania and Nyerere and African socialism. I talk about intentional communities in Japan, and so there's a way in which I was I got out of my East European lane in a way that I might not have done had the pandemic not prevented me from going to Eastern Europe, which is what I should have been doing for that year. I was supposed to be on leave and everything got locked down, so I had to do something else with my time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you kind of were able to adapt and think globally in a way that.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. So the question says, you've written many books. What did you enjoy or not enjoy through the experience of writing it?
Of this one?
Of this one.
Oh, so what did I enjoy? So this is my 12th book. And I enjoyed doing something different. That was, it was really nice to kind of, like I said, to get out of my lane a little bit. Almost every single one of my earlier books was sort of focused on a particular sort of historical moment and a particular historical problem. And this book was much more wide-ranging. So that being said, what I didn't enjoy was having to learn to write for a general audience and having my vocabulary constrained and having to sort of fight for my endnotes. Really, as a scholar, it is not always easy to translate the kinds of things that I want to talk about to people who don't read academic writing. So it was a great learning experience. I think I'm a much better person for having done it, but it was hard. And sometimes, it was, like, for instance, in anthropology, we use this word consanguineous or non-consanguineous, which just means blood-related. But those are words that you can't use. And so there was a constant kind of policing of language that I found interesting and sometimes challenging because you're trained in a particular way with a particular set of vocabulary, and then you really have to struggle to say, okay, I'm not going to talk that way. I'm just going to talk as if I was explaining this to my mom or my daughter, right? My mom probably more. My daughter would have gotten it, but my mom, yeah. And that is a challenge. So.
It is. I've definitely experienced this too with my own work, where I start off with a script with graphic narratives, similar to like a screenplay for a movie. You have a script, or at least I do, and I would send it to an editor, start making imagery, and then almost always the comments are, cut it in half. It's too long. It's too long. Simpler, simpler, simpler. And each time I think, no, it's very, very painful when you're, the academic system sort of trains you to be as verbose as possible.
Yeah.
And remembering to keep things simple is very difficult. But it reads beautifully and very, very smoothly, and it's so much fun. Does writing get easier with each book you publish?
I wish that were so. I mean, getting words on a page gets easier, right? And finishing a project gets easier, because I know I've written books before. I know that this will eventually get done. It will eventually be a physical object that people are reading. I will, have to go out there and talk about it. So that part gets easier. But the actual writing, of just getting yourself out of bed, getting your butt in the chair, drinking the coffee and saying, blank cursor, blinking cursor on a blank page, hello, Kristen, good morning. You now have to produce words and thoughts, and they have to be somewhat intelligent and coherent. That's not easy ever. I mean, I have many good friends who are fiction writers, and I think when you're a fiction writer, you live in the realm of imagination. And for us who are writing in the realm of nonfiction and ideas, you're constrained in a way that you can't just spitball in the same way that you can. But I will say that writing the personal anecdotes that you mentioned at the beginning of the chapters, often that was my way into the chapter, and that helped a lot. But yeah, I mean, I think writing, and I do feel, I've written enough books now that I feel like I think I can call myself a writer.
I think you can.
It doesn't get easier necessarily. It just you get more disciplined. It's like a muscle that you flex, and if you don't flex it, you lose it, and if you flex it often, you're good at it. It doesn't mean it isn't hard. It just means that you're used to it. Yeah.
Yeah. I love this question. So what is bringing you joy right now to create your own utopia?
Oh, this is sort of embarrassing in a way, right? I mean, I read a lot of science fiction and I watch a lot of science fiction. I've just read a couple of really good books in the genre of what's called cli-fi, climate fiction. And a lot of cli-fi is very depressing, but there's a new kind of more utopian cli-fi. And I really love being challenged to imagine weird ways in which the world can be different that I never thought of before. So part of that is giving me joy, just the way of enjoying other people's imagination of a positive future. It means I'm also watching a lot of Star Trek, because that's a place where I get a lot of hope. But outside of the realm of popular culture, what is also bringing me joy is seeing the way, and this is a really concrete example. My daughter is a Swiftie.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and she's a serious Swiftie. And I went to New York the day that I literally flew back from Belgium and met her, and she dragged me to the Taylor Swift movie for 3 hours, where I thought, I'm going to die. I don't know how I'm going to stay awake for this. but it was really important to her. She really wanted me to see it, and so I went. And I don't know if you know anything about this.
I know nothing
okay.
about this.
So the thing
I'm
about this
sorry.
is it was exclusively released to AMC, and the way that people watched it was as if it was a live concert. So people were standing up and dancing and singing in the seats in the theater. This was in New York. It was so joyous. People were so happy, and it was just a film, right? But there was a connectivity and a sense of community, and I think the Swifties are a very tight community. And it doesn't matter that it's being mediated by this now billionaire pop star. People are making that community. They're trading their friendship bracelets. They're singing the lyrics to the song. They're holding hands. They're, turning their phone lights on to sway. And I was in that room, and okay, I was really tired and I was really jet lagged, but I was so moved at the way that, and it was mostly young women, not all. There were other moms, Occasionally there's a dad in the audience. I saw a guy with a T-shirt that said, "It's me, hi, I'm the father, it's me," which I thought was so funny. It's a reference to a song, but the community, that connection in the real world felt, so important. And it was like a $20 ticket. It was $19.89 was the cost of the ticket. But it brought people together in a way that I think is so beautiful and is so important for us in this moment as we come out of this pandemic where we were isolated, and as we live in a society which is increasingly more and more and more divided and polarized. We need those moments when we come together. And so that kind of thing just brings me so much happiness when I see it happening.
And it's happening naturally, right? Like the Taylor Swift movie, I would never expect anything like that. And honestly, this makes me like Taylor Swift a lot more, or at least a little bit more than I did before, which was at a negative. Yeah. So we brought it up to neutral, which is surprising to me. Great. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have this afternoon. Kristen, thank you so much for sharing your book and a background and takeaways from Everyday Utopia. It was so much fun to read. I love talking about the book with you. I feel like we can talk for hours about it. I want to note that the Penn Lightbulb Café is generously funded by the Adolf and Felicia Leon Fund, which supports Penn Arts and Sciences programming and lecture series. And we hope you can join us for the next Global Discovery webinar on November 9th with Professor Jonathan Katz, who will be discussing the emergence of the term homosexual in the 19th century and the various ways new identities were depicted in celebrated works of art. Please follow the Penn Arts and Sciences and the Global Discovery series websites, or follow both on social media to learn about that and many other events. And thank you all for taking part in our first virtual book club, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.